18. We're going to continue our discussion on the endocrine system. Today we're going to cover specifically the thyroid gland, the pancreas, which you're going to be finding is kind of interesting because it's both endocrine and exocrine function, and some of the other endocrine gland and tissues discussed in your lecture text. So pretty much we're going to follow the same pattern from the previous lecture, where we'll talk about a little bit about the structure of each gland and talk about the hormones that it secrete and its regulation and their physiological effects. So let's begin. Okay, so remember, we're going to talk about the thyroid gland, the pancreas, and some of the endocrine glands. Some of the other glands we'll talk about include the parathyroid gland. So from its name, you should get an idea that it's pretty close to a thyroid gland. The pineal gland, which we briefly mentioned when we talked about the brain. The thymus, the gonads, or the reproductive organs, adipose tissue, the heart, and the kidney. So let's begin. Let's start with the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland is convenient because it secretes thyroid hormones and another hormone called calcitonin. And from its name, you probably get an idea that it might have to do with calcium. The thyroid gland is right in front of the larynx. And the hormones that it secretes, the thyroid hormones, regulates growth and metabolism. And calcitonin, as we mentioned, regulates calcium metabolism. Okay. The thyroid gland itself is surrounded by follicular cells that produce the thyroid hormones. And these follicles produce a material called colloid. This colloid is composed of protein and iodine rich material containing the precursors to make the thyroid hormones. So here's a picture showing the histology of the thyroid gland, and we see that they have these central glandular duct surrounded by these follicular cells. And these follicular cells is what's going to produce, store the colloid and produce the hormones. And as you can see, as with any other endocrine gland, there's going to be a close relationship with the circulatory system. So that's how they're going to be transported throughout the body. Now, the thyroid hormones themselves, they're important metabolic regulators. And so they have a strong influence on the body's metabolism. The hormones, as we mentioned before, has an amino acid core bound to iodine atoms. That's one reason why in the Western world, our salt is iodized. So no one will be deficient in iodine. The thyroid hormones have specific names. There's T3 and T4, indicating the number of iodine atoms present in the molecule. Triiodothyronine, or T3, contains 3 iodine atoms, and thyroxine contains, or T4, contains 4 iodine atoms. Now, in comparison, T3 has more physiological activity than T4. Okay, and this will come to play a little bit later in our discussion. So remember, T3 has more activity than T4. Now, thyroid hormones themselves are kind of unusual because we usually think of protein hormones as being hydrophilic. However, T3 and T4 are composed of nonpolar and hydrophobic amino acids, so it's kind of unusual as being a hydrophobic protein hormone. Because of its chemical nature, it can diffuse into target cells and bind nuclear receptors without any, having to bind to receptors on the cell surface of the membrane. And within the nucleus, it can activate or inhibit gene transcription. Now, we mentioned that the thyroid hormones have a big influence on metabolism. So it's not surprising that nearly every cell in the body has thyroid hormone receptors, suggesting that its importance overall on metabolism. It has 3 main effects. One, it sets the metabolic rate, how fast our metabolism is running or how slow it is. Thermal regulation, as a byproduct of metabolism, we generate heat. It's also a warmer body. Also, metabolism is influenced by growth and development. And thyroid hormones themselves are synergistic with the sympathetic nervous system. In other words, side by side with the sympathetic nervous system, they will produce a greater effect than each of them by themselves. How are thyroid hormones produced? Well, it's a multi-step process. As we mentioned, it starts with the colloid and the follicle cells. So we'll take it a few steps at a time. So iodide and thyroglobulin accumulate in the colloid. Okay. Iodide ions are converted to iodine atoms, so they have no charge, and attach to thyroglobulin, forming iodinated thyroglobulin. So we see in the first two steps the iodide atoms, okay, that are pumped into the cell, or are brought into the cell, and thyroglobulin are secreted into the colloid. Okay, so here's the colloid here. The iodide ions are converted into iodine atoms, as we mentioned, with no charge, and they attach to the thyroglobulin. The iodinated thyroglobulin enters the follicle cells by endocytosis, okay, and converted to T3 and T4 by lysosomal enzymes. 90% of the hormone is T4, and the rest T3. Okay, so here we see that the iodinated thyroglobulin enters the follicle cell by endocytosis and is converted to T3 and T4 by lysosomal enzyme. So it's kind of interesting that the iodide is brought here into the colloid and then is brought back in by endocytosis to form the active hormones. T3 and T4 are then released into the blood with most binding plasma proteins. To remember, unlike most protein hormones that are hydrophilic, they can diffuse right into the plasma. But since T3 and T4 are hydrophobic, they must bind plasma proteins. Some unbound hormones are known as free T3 and T4. And interestingly, only the free T3 and T4 have biological activity. So they have to be removed by their plasma proteins to have their effect. So here in the last figure here, we see T3 and T4 released into the blood. Now, the question is, why produce more T4 if T3 is the more active form? Because remember earlier we said T3 was more active than T4? Well, the reason why is that many tissues can convert T4 into T3. So forming T3 is not too much of a problem. Another reason is that a large supply of T4 in the blood provides a supply of T3, and T3 has a shorter half-life. It means it breaks down faster than T4. So it seems a lot more logical to store more T4 than T3, and then transform it to T3 when it's needed. So you can see here that T3 has a half-life of 2.5 days, whereas T4 has a longer half-life of 6.5 days. Now, what stimulates thyroid hormone production? Well, a decrease in T3 and T4 is one stimulus. Okay, so when the body needs more thyroid hormone, more hormone will be made. Or also cold temperatures will also increase thyroid hormone production. Remember, one of the effects is to maintain metabolism and body temperature. So cold temperatures will stimulate thyroid hormone production. Now, those stimulants will increase thyroid releasing hormone and thyroid stimulating hormone from the hypothalamus and from the pituitary when free T3 and T4 fall or in the body exposed to cold temperatures. The hypothalamic receptors detect changes in thyroid hormone levels or temperature. The stimulus. So here we see the stimulus, a decrease in T3 and T4 in the blood or exposure to cold this will stimulate or bind to receptors in the hypothalamus, and it detects the change. Okay. Now, just like the other hormones we mentioned before, it's regulated by a multi-tiered negative feedback loop. So, thyrotropin-releasing hormone is secreted from the hypothalamus, and thyroid-releasing hormone stimulates production of thyroid-stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. Okay. So once the receptors in the hypothalamus detect the change, the first tier control stimulates the hypothalamus to secrete TRH. These bind receptors in the anterior pituitary to release or secrete thyroid-stimulating hormone. Okay. Remember, this is your hypothalamic pituitary connection here. Thyroid-stimulating hormone stimulates multiple responses from the thyroid gland. So, one, it increases the production of T3 and T4 by follicle cells. It increases secretion of T3 and T4 from follicles into the blood, and stimulates overall growth and development of the thyroid gland. So not only helps the rest of the body, but also helps maintain the thyroid gland. And so here are the major effects of the thyroid response to TSH. Make more T3 and T4, secrete T3 and T4 in the blood, and growth and development of the thyroid gland. Now, as we mentioned, negative feedback plays an important role in many hormones, and it's no different with the thyroid hormone. So both thyroid-releasing hormone and thyroid-stimulating hormone are both inhibited by rising levels of T3 and T4. So as free T3 and T4 increase, TSH and TRH are then inhibited. Okay, so here we see the negative feedback, not only at the level of the pituitary, but also at the level of the hypothalamus. As you might expect, since the thyroid hormone has a big role in metabolism, there might be disorders in which it's overproduced or underproduced. And so when thyroid hormone is overproduced, it's hyperthyroidism, and when it's underproduced, it's hypothyroidism. Examples of hyperthyroidism, or an increase in thyroid hormone, is Graves' disease. And it's due to the abnormal immune proteins that mimic TSH. So in other words, there are immune proteins that are produced that kind of act like TSH. And the result, you have an extreme effects of what you would think would be thyroid hormone: weight loss, heat intolerance, increased blood pressure, and disruption in heart rhythm. So similar symptoms of Graves' disease. Another evidence of hyperthyroidism is enlargement of the thyroid gland called goiter. So here you can see this picture here of an enlarged thyroid gland. So to treat it, you use drugs that inhibit T3 and T4 production, or just remove the thyroid gland. Now, cases of hypothyroidism may be due to iodine deficiency or destruction of the thyroid gland, called Hashimoto's thyroiditis. And the symptoms include weight gain, cold intolerance, slow heart rate, hypotension, and goiter. And so the treatment is iodine or thyroid hormone supplements. Okay. Now, we also mentioned that the thyroid gland produces another hormone called calcitonin. And these are produced by the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland. And calcitonin is due to hypercalcemia. So in other words, it's secreted in response to high blood levels of calcium. Okay, so here we're looking at the thyroid follicles again, and we see the parafollicular cells in between the follicular cells. Now, as you might expect, calcitonin will decrease blood calcium levels due to hypercalcemia. So your typical negative feedback mechanism: calcium goes up, calcitonin is secreted, and calcium is brought back down. Now, how does this do this? Well, what it does, it inhibits osteoclast cells. Okay, And by inhibiting osteoclast cells, it leaves the osteoblasts unopposed. Okay. So if you remember from our bone lectures in SCB 203, osteoclasts break down bone, osteoblasts build bone. And so by osteoblasts building bone, calcium is incorporated into bone, decreasing blood calcium levels by depositing it into bone and decreasing blood calcium levels. So osteoblasts deposit calcium in the bone, decreasing blood calcium levels. Let's take a look at the parathyroid glands. There are 4 glands posterior to the thyroid that secrete parathyroid hormone. Okay, so the parathyroid gland, as you might expect, is very near the thyroid gland. Okay, so this is looking from the back view, the posterior view. Okay, so here's the back of the pharynx, and we see the tiny little parathyroid glands in the back of the thyroid gland. Parathyroid glands have cells called chief cells, and these secrete the parathyroid hormone, or PTH, in response to hypocalcemia. So this is in response to a low blood calcium level. As a result, parathyroid hormone will increase blood calcium levels. So here we have calcitonin from the thyroid gland and parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid glands that are antagonistic to one another to help maintain blood calcium levels. So how does parathyroid hormone work? It increases calcium by stimulating osteoclasts. Okay, so it does the opposite as calcitonin. It stimulates calcitriol. Calcitriol is the active form of vitamin D to increase the absorption of dietary calcium from the small intestine, increasing tubular absorption of calcium from kidneys. So let's look at the regulation of calcium homeostasis by parathyroid hormone. The stimulus is a decrease in blood calcium below normal range, and the receptors are chief cells in the parathyroid gland that detect low blood calcium levels. Okay, so here there's a drop in blood calcium levels, and these are chief cells in the parathyroid gland detect the low blood calcium levels. So those are the receptors. The control center are the chief cells again, and they increase parathyroid secretion. And the effector response is to target osteoclasts. Okay, I guess I made a little typo here. The kidneys and the small intestine increase blood calcium levels. Okay, so the osteoclasts will secrete parathyroid hormone and will have effects on osteoclasts to increase blood calcium levels, as well as decrease increased calcium absorption by the kidneys and calcitriol to increase blood calcium levels. Then once again, regulation is by negative feedback. So blood calcium returns back to the normal range, and the chief cells are inhibit parathyroid hormone secretion. And so we're back to the homeostatic range here. The pancreas. The pancreas secretes 2 important hormones in addition to its exocrine functions. And the 2 hormones are insulin and glucagon, and they're antagonistic hormones that will maintain blood glucose levels. So whereas calcitonin and the parathyroid hormone are regulating calcium, insulin and glucagon are maintaining glucose levels. So here's just a brief picture, a discussion on the pancreas. It's kind of club-shaped. Okay, it's a long body, little tail. Okay, and you can see it's kind of right by the stomach. And we have 2 types of cells in the pancreas that we're going to be talking about. One set of cells are the pancreatic islet cells, or islets of Langerhans, and these are endocrine in function. Okay, we also have acinar cells. And if you remember from SCB 203, you might have heard the term acinar cells in terms of exocrine glands. And so another function of the pancreas, in addition to its endocrine functions, is to secrete enzymes and other products into the digestive tract. We'll talk more about this when we cover the digestive system. So right now, we're going to hold on to this for now, and we're going to primarily talk about the endocrine system. Okay, so here's the pancreatic islet cells containing the endocrine cells, and surrounding it are the ducts surrounded by the acinar cells. So we can distinctly see these are exocrine and then these are the endocrine cells. Now, the pancreatic islet cells, or the islets of Langerhans, secrete hormones. There are 3 cell types: alpha, beta, and delta. Alpha cells secrete the peptide hormone glucagon. Beta cells secrete the protein hormone insulin. And delta cells secrete the peptide somatostatin, which we mentioned before in the brain. So here, they color-coded it here for you to be able to tell them apart, but normally you can't really see them too distinctly: alpha cells, beta cells, and delta cells. So of course, you should know which cells secrete which hormones. Let's start with glucagon and insulin. Okay, glucagon will increase glucose and other metabolic fuels in the blood. It will increase blood glucose levels. And it has several targets: liver, muscle, and adipose tissue. One of its functions is glycogenolysis. And as you can tell, if we break down this word, it's the breakdown of glycogen into glucose. Because remember, in SCB 203, you learned that glycogen is a macromolecule of many glucose molecules. It's a storage farm for glucose. Gluconeogenesis. Okay, this is the ability to form new glucose from other energy sources. It will stimulate protein breakdown into muscle tissue, and it releases fats from adipose tissue. And it will help form what are called ketone bodies in the liver. Okay, when you break down fats, a byproduct of metabolism of fats is ketone bodies, which for the one part is good for the heart because the heart can use ketone bodies, but another problem is that it produces acidosis, and it's called ketoacidosis, which is not good. So ketone bodies are 4 carbon molecules from lipolysis, and the liver releases in the bloodstream. The heart and skeletal muscle can oxidize ketone bodies, which is good. However, ketone bodies may decrease blood pH by ketoacidosis. So overproduction of ketone bodies is not good. Stimulation of glucagon. What stimulates glucagon release? Well, one of the most common ones is a decrease in blood glucose. Blood glucose drops. This will stimulate glucagon production to increase blood glucose. Stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system. Catecholamines from the adrenal medulla, as well as ingested proteins. And we'll maybe talk a little about this when we cover the digestive system. Glucagon is inhibited by increase in blood glucose and somatostatin. So we've seen that somatostatin is often an inhibitory hormone for other hormones as well. Now let's talk about insulin. It's the primary antagonist of glucagon. So this will decrease blood glucose levels and will promote the uptake and storage of ingested nutrients into target cells, in addition to glucose. As a result, it will decrease blood glucose levels, opposite of glucagon. And it targets the liver, cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, and in some parts of the brain. What does insulin do? Insulin increases the uptake of lipids, amino acids, and glucose. Okay. Increases the synthesis of glycogen in the liver. Increases the synthesis of fat from lipids and carbohydrates. It promotes satiety, meaning that our satisfaction that, when we've eaten enough. Without insulin, cells can be bathed in glucose and yet essentially starve, because insulin is required to bring the glucose into the cell. by decreasing secretion during decreases secretion during fasting and increases secretion during feeding. Of course, if the secretion is too high, then the blood glucose decreases, producing hypoglycemia. So that's bad too. And if you ever met someone who is diabetic or hypoglycemic, oops, that should be an L right here. This L is over here. One of the common symptoms is dizziness and confusion because of the requirement of glucose that's used by the brain. Okay, so weakness, dizziness, rapid breathing, nausea, to low levels of hypoglycemia. Higher levels of hypoglycemia may cause confusion, hallucinations, seizures, coma, or even death. Okay. And it can be due to over-administration of insulin or agents that lower blood glucose. It can be due to prolonged starvation. It can be due to insulin-secreting tumors or even alcohol that may produce hypoglycemia. And it can be hereditary and be genetic metabolic conditions. Hyperglycemia is considered anything over 100 milligrams per deciliters. It's due to increased blood glucose from insufficient insulin secretion or decreased insulin sensitivity. And the most common causes is diabetes mellitus, and we have both type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus, okay, and it's rarer, 5 to 10% of diabetics in the U.S. And this is an autoimmune disease that destroys beta cells in pancreas, so it's lack of insulin to allow glucose to enter the cells. And it's characterized by hyperglycemia and due to target cells unable to take in glucose. And glucose is overproduced in the liver due to unopposed action of glucagon. Some of the effects of diabetes mellitus is increased glucose, glucosuria, and ketone bodies, ketonuria. And what happens? Excess molecules draws waters by osmosis in the urine, resulting in frequent urination, called polyuria, and dehydration, causing excessive thirst, called polydipsia. The treatment is insulin injections, okay, and requires strict monitoring of diet and blood glucose for diabetic ketoacidosis that may lead to coma or death. So this is the acidosis we mentioned about production of ketone bodies. Chronic hyperglycemia may damage blood vessels, heart, and lower limbs. It may cause decreased circulation, cause heart attacks, non-healing wounds, and may require amputation. Peripheral nerves may be damaged in the lower limbs, leading to peripheral neuropathy. Other tissues include the lens, the retina, and kidneys, resulting in blindness and kidney failure as a result of diabetes mellitus type 1. Type 2 diabetes is called the non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus, and it's the most common form. Patients have functional beta cells but do not have response to increases in blood glucose. And as a result, insulin is normal, but other organs have insulin resistance. They're less responsive to insulin, so maybe at the receptor level. Results in hyperglycemia and other signs such as glycosuria, polyuria, and polydipsia, which we mentioned just now. And there's insufficient insulin to prevent ketoacidosis. And it's strongly associated with heredity and also obesity. And the complications are the same as in type 1 diabetes. It can be, most often it can be controlled by weight loss, a healthy diet, and exercise. Now, if you notice that blood glucose regulation are antagonistic and is a negative feedback loop between insulin and glucagon. Okay, so both insulin and glucagon are secreted during feeding to maintain blood glucose homeostasis. Okay. So what happens when there's an increase in blood glucose levels? Increase in blood glucose levels above the normal range during feeding or to cortisol. Receptors are the beta cells of the pancreas that detect the increase in blood glucose concentration. Okay, so we see right here that the receptors are the beta cells. And the control center are also the beta cells that will increase insulin secretion. And at the same time, glucagon will decrease from the alpha cells. Okay. So beta cells secrete insulin, at the same time alpha cells will inhibit glucagon secretion. And the effect is insulin will decrease blood glucose levels by an increase in glucose uptake in the cells. Sometimes there may be a slight increase in glucagon secretion due to proteins in the food to prevent hypoglycemia if it contains low carbohydrates. We'll mention some of this when we cover the digestive system. Okay. And so the effect is an increase in blood glucose uptake by the cells. Okay. We'll have storage of glucose, amino acids, and fats in the form of proteins, fats, and glycogen. The homeostatic range and negative feedback, as glucose returns to normal range, negative feedback of beta cells decreases insulin secretion. Okay, and we're back to the homeostatic range. What if there's a decrease in blood glucose levels? Well, a decrease in blood glucose levels below the normal range due to fasting or increased use of insulin in diabetics will bring the blood glucose level down. And here, the receptors are alpha cells, and alpha cells of the pancreas will detect the decreased blood glucose concentration. And the control center is also the alpha cells that will increase glucagon secretion. And at the same time, insulin secretion by beta cells decreases. Okay, so the opposite occurs when there is a decrease in blood glucose levels. The effector and response due to the increase in glucagon will increase blood glucose by glycogenolysis and formation of new glucose by gluconeogenesis. It also increases other fuels such as ketone bodies and free amino acids and fatty acids. So pretty much the exact opposite as we've seen in response to insulin. As a result, blood glucose levels go back to the homeostatic range through negative feedback. And then alpha cells will decrease in glucagon secretion. So let's talk about the other hormone secreting tissues, such as the pineal gland, thymus, the reproductive organs called the gonads, adipose tissue, the heart, and kidneys. The pineal gland, we mentioned earlier, it secretes melatonin. Melatonin is related to light and dark cycles, their circadian rhythms. It begins in the evening and peaks at night. It targets sleep regulating centers in the reticular formation, which we mentioned when we were talking about the brain stem, and it does the sleep phase of sleep-wake cycles. So this has an influence, for example, if you take these transcontinental flights in which your day and night cycles gets thrown off, and that's what produces jet lag. The thymus, you learned about this at SCB 203 because this was the site of T lymphocyte maturation, and it's located in the mediastinum. Okay, so here's the thymus gland. Okay. Thymus gland secretes hormones thymosin and thymopoietin. Okay, and these are paracrine hormones that assist in T lymphocyte maturation. And you might have learned in SCB 203 that the thymus is larger in infants and children as the immune system is developed and then atrophies as we get older. The gonads, are the ovaries and testes that produce the sex hormone. We'll talk more about them when we cover the reproductive system. But for now, we'll just give you a slight overview. The testes and ovaries are the primary male and female reproductive organs, and they're responsible for production of gametes, the sperm, the male, and ova in the female. And they produce the sex steroid hormones for gamete production and other functions. The testes produces primarily the steroid hormone testosterone. Females produce a small amount from the adrenal cortex and ovaries. In males, It's again regulated by a multi-tiered negative feedback loop involving the hypothalamus and pituitary. Briefly, gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus triggers both LH and FSH from the anterior pituitary. It's LH that stimulates testosterone synthesis. FSH stimulates production of a protein that binds testosterone and concentrates it into the testes. Testosterone will decrease gonadotropin releasing hormone secretion and also decrease LH and FSH secretion. So there's a negative feedback mechanism like other endocrine hormones. Since testosterone is made from cholesterol, it can cross the plasma membrane of target cells and binds intracellular receptors to influence expression of various genes. And it has two basic effects. It has anabolic effects, it builds things up like muscle mass, and it also has androgenic effects, whose male secondary sex characteristics. The ovaries produces estrogens and progesterone. Okay. Again, it's primarily produced in females with smaller amounts in males. Again, as we mentioned before, it's regulated by negative feedback loops involving gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus and LH and FSH from the anterior pituitary, just like in the male. It stimulates development of secondary sex characteristics in the female. It will regulate the menstrual cycle of mature, reproductively mature females, and also has multiple effects on other tissues and organs. Let's take a look at progesterone. Progesterone will peak after ovulation and during pregnancy, and it prepares the body for pregnancy and supports fetal development. It has other effects on smooth muscle, body temperature, blood clotting, bone tissue, and metabolism, so it has many other effects as well. Adipose tissue produces a hormone called leptin. Now, this is a protein hormone that can cross the blood-brain barrier to hypothalamic neurons that control feeding. And leptin will increase satiety, that tells us we're satisfied of eating, and prevents overeating. The heart, you might have learned in SCB 203, it produces a hormone called atrial natriuretic peptide. Okay. Atrial natriuretic peptide is secreted due to increase in blood volume. So most of the safety mechanisms of the cardiovascular system worries about a decrease in blood volume. Atrial natriuretic peptide is one of the few that is secreted due to increase in blood volume. And they're stimulated by stretch-sensitive ion channels in the heart. And it targets smooth muscle blood vessels and kidney tubules. And what it does, it vasodilates blood vessels. And in the kidney, it causes natriuresis. Natriuresis is the excretion of sodium in water. So if you ever want to know why the abbreviation of sodium is Na, it's based on this word, natriuresis. Both vasodilation and natriuresis decrease blood pressure. The kidneys produce another hormone that you might have learned in SCB 203 called erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is secreted in response to low blood oxygen. And erythropoietin will act on the red bone marrow to stimulate development of erythrocytes. Other kidney effects is that enzyme renin converts angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1, and the conversion of vitamin D into calcitriol. And here's the overview of the hormones that we've covered so far. And